Welcome to the EFC webinar. My name is Karen Stiller. Sorry about that. Today we're looking at the issue of human trafficking, and we're joined by Julia Beazley, who is Director of Public Policy for the EFC. Julia spends a lot of her time working on this issue for the EFC. Welcome, Julia, now that you can hear me.
Good to be here.
Good. Thank you. I'd like us to start at the very beginning and assume that some of us, like me, don't know exactly what some of these definitions are. So when we're talking about human trafficking in Canada, what exactly are we talking about?
So the definition of human trafficking that I like best is the one that's found in the United Nations Palermo Protocol, which Canada ratified or signed on to in 2002. The protocol, we've got it up on the screen, defines trafficking as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power, or of a position of vulnerability, or the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. And David can flip to the next screen so you can see the full definition. So it's a mouthful, but I really like this definition because it is so clear and it's so comprehensive. Among other things, it specifically considers the abuse of power or of vulnerability, and what we might think of as both sort of visible and invisible forms of coercion. It specifically makes mention of the exploitation of the person, which is important. And it also makes a clear distinction between labor trafficking and sex trafficking, which again is really important because while both crimes involve exploitation of vulnerable persons, I think it's really critical that we have the ability to analyze the factors that are unique to sexual exploitation, like violence against women, misogyny, gender inequality, and so on. So,
okay, go ahead.
So what we know in Canada is that the overwhelming majority of trafficking here is domestic, and it's for exploitation in the commercial sex trade. So roughly 95% of all cases where human trafficking charges were laid between 2005 and January 2017 were domestic and primarily involved sexual exploitation. So this means that in Canada, it is mainly Canadian women and girls who are being trafficked, and they are being trafficked into prostitution in hotels, massage parlors, advertised and sold online. We know that victims are mostly female. They are mostly young. Most of them know their trafficker, either as a casual acquaintance, an intimate partner quite often, or in some kind of a business relationship. And that most traffickers are male and they're under the age of 24.
Wow, that is so shockingly young.
Yeah.
So, first of all, when I have thought of human trafficking in the past, I've watched too many movies, but I've imagined the crossing the border, the smuggling in of vulnerable people from other countries. But when you say it's domestic, you're talking about from one Canadian community to another, typically.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are certain things that make some girls more vulnerable. For example, poverty, racism, mental health struggles, addiction. They may be homeless. They may be in government care. Quite often, these are girls that nobody is keeping particularly close tabs on. But what we've seen increasingly is that a lot of the victims come from what we would consider normal homes, because the vulnerabilities are sometimes more subtle. So it could be low self-esteem, struggling to fit in or find your place, having problems at home or with friends. So traffickers know how to detect and exploit these vulnerabilities. And so, what we might see is that a girl is recruited online on a social media platform quite often. So it can start with something as simple as an invitation to a party by someone who seems like a peer. Or someone may say, hey, you're really pretty or talented. You should be a model or an actress. I can help make that happen. But it is very, very common for the pimp or the trafficker to be a boyfriend. So this is somebody who comes into the girl's life as kind of a Prince Charming or a knight in shining armor. He takes her to nice places and buys her nice things, quite often involves drugs and alcohol, and then isolates her from friends and family and essentially becomes her whole world. But then after some time, he turns on her and says, you know what, you're going to pay me back for all of these nice things that I've done for you, and this is how you're going to do it.
Wow. So we're talking about forcing young women into prostitution, basically.
Primarily, yeah. We've had some high-profile cases of labor trafficking in Canada in the last decade or so. So that's a concern as well. And we need to be proactive and vigilant in detecting and prosecuting when and where this occurs. But it remains true that the vast majority of trafficking here in Canada is for sexual exploitation.
And I know we've had these very big debates in Canada about the legalization or decriminalization of prostitution and so on. How do these two issues come together when we're talking about human trafficking? Because we want to protect these young women, obviously.
Yeah, well, you can't deny that there are women who say they are prostituting themselves willingly, especially because some of them tend to do so quite loudly. But the research and the anecdotal evidence, and certainly what I know from the survivor-led organizations I work with, all tell us that this is just not the case for the vast majority of women in prostitution. But those who argue choice are a vocal minority. But I would say that whether or not there is third-party involvement or control by a pimp or trafficker, it is quite likely that she is in prostitution because of a lack of choice or a lack of good choices. So this is what we would call constrained choice. When you don't have any other viable means of paying for food or shelter or feeding your children, is that really a choice? When you age out of government care and you have nowhere to go, or you're recruited right out of foster care, is that a choice? If you have been sexually abused and men have been taking that from you, and you decide to take back some sense of control and at least get some money for it, is that truly a choice? So these are all the variables that just have to be part of our analysis. And this is why when we talk about how we can eliminate trafficking or sexual exploitation, it's so important to focus on the one party in the transaction that we can be really certain is making a free choice, and that's the buyer.
Okay.
So we've talked before about how prostitution, human trafficking, it's all based on supply and demand. And the reality is, as long as there is a demand for paid sex, there will be people who will ensure there's a supply. Human trafficking simply wouldn't happen if there weren't so many men willing to pay for sex with trafficked women, girls, and boys.
So with Bill C-36 that was passed in 2014, it felt like we had dealt with that as a country and that we had criminalized the act of buying sex, if I'm summarizing it correctly.
Yeah.
But is that bill vulnerable to being changed now? What's happening?
Yeah, unfortunately, there are a lot of indications that the current laws are vulnerable. We know, for example, that the current government was not supportive of them when they were passed. During the cross-country Justice Committee hearings, which have happened last month, some members actually said that they didn't like the laws and wanted them repealed. We know, if you've been following the news, that at last week's Liberal convention, a resolution brought forward by the Young Liberals to decriminalize prostitution was passed. So we're very concerned that there is a strong push to do away with our current laws in favor of either decriminalization or some form of legalization. And this is really troubling.
Yeah. Let me interject now to encourage anyone who's watching the webinar live that you can send in questions using the chat function on the screen. If you have things you'd like to ask Julia about directly, this is a great time to do that. So, Julia, what do you think is the likelihood that the bill will be changed?
It's hard to say. So we're watching really closely what's happening with the Justice Committee. They've been doing this study since February, I think, and they'll be wrapping up soon. So I've attended all of the meetings that happened here in Ottawa and have been in dialogue with colleagues who participated in the meetings across the country, which unfortunately were not recorded or televised. So we've all been talking, trying to stay on top of what's been happening. But there does seem to be a real push. It's come up. It's odd to me that it has come up so much in a conversation about human trafficking. So, for example, when the committee toured, they gave a lot of airtime to the concerns of the sex industry as it relates to human trafficking. So they sort of divided up the days so that not everyone was in the room at the same time. Okay. You know, that probably logistically makes sense. But at the same time, I thought, you know, if if the industry and if sex buyers were so intent on rooting out any and all trafficking, it just wouldn't exist, or it would be exceedingly rare, because if that were so, it wouldn't have anywhere to go and there wouldn't be any willing buyers. So it's been a bit frustrating to sort of watch the dialogue and how it's shifting. So we have long argued that you can't talk about human trafficking without talking about prostitution. Because as Dr. Melissa Farley says, prostitution is where human trafficking happens.
Yeah.
She also talks about how the relationship between prostitution, human trafficking, and pornography is circular and continuous. So pornography, we've been saying, feeds the demand for paid sex, which is what fuels sex trafficking. And increasingly, we're seeing that many women and girls are trafficked for use in pornography. So quite often they're being exploited on screen and off screen. So there's this move to try and keep these issues separate, which just doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah. Just to go back a little bit, the stat you gave that the young men involved in trafficking are sometimes 24 years and younger. Mm-hmm. Do we know anything more about them? Like, that just seems so young to me. What is their profile? Are they being used by someone else, or do we know that?
You know what? We don't know that. And so one of the things that we have talked about is the need for better data collection. We submitted a brief to the Justice Committee this morning, and that was one of our recommendations, that, we need to know who the victims are. Yeah. Who are the perpetrators? Collect information about the age, race, sex, nationality of the victim. Are factors like poverty, homelessness, mental health, and so on, were these things at play? How was the victim recruited, and what was the relationship to the pimp or the trafficker? So we need to get a better picture of the whole situation. But quite often they will just, it seems as though they are fairly average guys. I mean, quite often there's gang involvement and so on. That for sure, you can't discount that there is that kind of activity. It is a very, very, very profitable business. And I think, people who, for whatever reason, are motivated by that profit, might consider getting involved. You can get a book on Amazon on how to be a pimp. Come on. There's actually literature out there that you can buy to teach you how to do this. How do you break someone in? How do you groom them? So it's glorified in a lot of music, pimp culture, right? It's a thing. So I think there's all these factors that play into why a young man might, why it might occur to them to do something like this.
Yeah. And I believe also we have the stats that show Indigenous women are overrepresented in women who are prostituted in Canada. So that adds a whole other layer to this issue in terms of Canadian issues. So what are people saying about that, and how does that change the topic?
Yeah, well, the RCMP has long recognized, as you say, that Indigenous girls are overrepresented among victims of trafficking, and they're certainly overrepresented in street-level prostitution. They are uniquely vulnerable because of poverty, violence, racism, isolation, marginalization, all of these things that are sort of the lasting effects of colonization in Canada. I think as a nation, we're finally giving some decent attention to the unacceptable number of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. But for far too long, no one but family members or loved ones really took their disappearances seriously or were looking for them. And we've got a long way to go in kind of writing our response to this. And all of this has made them especially vulnerable. So the National Action Plan to Combat Human Trafficking, which has now expired, recognized this unique vulnerability, and so had directed some funds and some efforts at awareness raising in vulnerable communities. And so, we need to emphasize that this has to be a particular focus in ongoing anti-trafficking efforts.
You mentioned the EFC making recommendations to the House of Commons Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights, which is studying human trafficking. What other recommendations did the EFC make?
So we recommended first that the government uphold the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, which we call PSEPA because it's easier to say, because this is a critical tool in curbing the demand for paid sexual services, which is, of course, what fuels sex trafficking. We also recommended that the definitions of human trafficking in Canadian legislation be harmonized. So there's one definition in the Criminal Code, another in the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. So they should be harmonized, they should be consistent, and specifically align as closely as possible with that definition in the Palermo Protocol that we read at the beginning, because it's clear, it's comprehensive, and it's widely adopted. I mentioned data collection. We need better data. We need national data. And we suggested that they work with not just law enforcement and government agencies, but also with NGOs and frontline organizations, because quite often they have a picture that never gets to law enforcement, because it's an under-prosecuted crime. It's under-reported. So quite often they know things. They have a better sense of what's going on than maybe law enforcement does. And it would be fantastic if we could come up with a standardized way for all of the parties involved to collect the kind of data we need, that it would be sort of collected in a central location. So the RCMP's National Coordination Center on Human Trafficking is a logical place. The other thing that came out in the committee hearings, which was surprising to me and to all the MPs, I think, was that it's not mandatory for law enforcement to report to this national center. So if we can sort of make that just part of the process, then I think we can get a much better picture of what's going on. We recommended also that the government either renew or implement a brand new national action plan that would include increased funding for victim services, ongoing training for law enforcement and other frontline personnel, and so on. And also that they develop a public education and awareness campaign. So Canada's had some good campaigns that sort of explain to people what human trafficking is, what does it look like, who's vulnerable, how, what to watch out for, that sort of thing. But we've never done one that really focuses on the demand, on those who might buy. Okay. There have been, so the Edmonton Police, for example, have done amazing work. They've done billboards, they've got ads in the personal classified sections right now that say, buying sex is a crime, Yeah. So there are certain police forces who are being very proactive about this, but it would be great if we had a national campaign that kind of reinforced this idea. It's not acceptable to buy people for sex.
I'm thinking about the buyers again. Like, what do we know about who they are? Years ago, I did a story for Faith Today on this issue, and I spoke to women who had been prostituted, some who were still active and some who had recently left. And what I understood from them was they were men in minivans on their way to work sometimes. Mm-hmm. It felt like they were sort of people we might know. Can you?
Yeah. Well, they are everyone. It's probably the simplest answer. It varies a little bit depending where you are and what the primary industry is. So I was at the Global Summit to End Sexual Exploitation a few weeks back, and we heard from different districts where they do keep profiles of who the buyers are. I don't think we do that well here in many places. But for example, in one jurisdiction where it's very high tech, they're educated, they're predominantly white, they are employed, but they're everybody. The age range is enormous. And then in another jurisdiction where it's more sort of construction or whatever, but I think the message is it can be anyone. But the pattern we do tend to see is that there is a relative there is an imbalance in terms of privilege. There's an imbalance in terms of education, of criminalization, of economic status, and so on. So the buyer's always kind of got this power of some sort, or this privilege over the one they're purchasing.
Yeah. And also, I'm thinking of the entrapment. Once a woman is in that life, sometimes I'm guessing there's addictions to help her cope, and then it becomes a bit of a vicious trap. Yeah. So tell us about how women and young girls typically get out. How does that happen?
Well, typically they will be found. So some of the police are doing a really good job. We've got some jurisdictions, I would say, in Canada that are enforcing the legislation very well. They are very proactive. they've really got it. They've understood what exploitation looks like, and are kind of doing their work accordingly. So they may find a girl online, they may find her in the hotel. They're no longer arresting her, they're no longer charging her, but instead they are reaching out, and sometimes they reach out repeatedly. If you need help, if you need help, if you need help, and she may eventually say, I need help. She may say right away, I need help, and then it starts a process. Or it could be, she comes into a hospital because quite often there's violence involved. So maybe she may get intercepted in a hospital by somebody who's kind of clued in and notices what's going on. There's all kinds of frontline organizations that do amazing work. A lot of these survivor-led organizations are working with women who currently are being exploited. And again, just building that relationship, that safety, so that, she may feel at some point, whether it happens right away or down the road, that she can sort of say, yes, this is what's happening to me and I need help, I need out. But it's a process. I would say that the process of exiting is rarely linear. Sometimes it is. But it's a process, and particularly where there is third-party control or involvement, because there's a lot of fear that goes along with that. They always have something that they can hold over you. They've videoed your initial rape or your breaking in process or whatever, and they've got something that they're going to hold over you. So that makes it all very complicated. It's a long and difficult process. And it requires very specialized care because the level of trauma is significant. Yeah. So it requires specific trauma-informed care.
So I'm thinking of somebody who might listen to this and think of a young woman they may see on the streets of their own town or city and start to wonder, well, maybe that person is not there of their own choice. What can we do? It's probably not, I'm guessing it's not the best idea to directly approach someone who we think might have been trafficked, or is that okay? What do we do?
That's a really tough, that's a tough question, because you don't know who's watching.
Okay.
If there's no third party that's kind of keeping tabs on her and watching who she talks to and what she does, then that would be great. You can strike up a relationship, just show compassion and care, but you don't know if there is somebody who's kind of keeping tabs on her, and that she will suffer consequences if she's seen sort of talking to someone. It's a really tricky thing. I think generally what I would advise people who are concerned and passionate is to talk to the people who know best.
Okay.
So talk to the survivor-led organizations about what's a good idea? What should I do and not do? What should I say and not say? What is the most helpful thing that I can do in this situation? So that would for sure be my strongest recommendation. And there's lots of survivor-led organizations out there who would be able to give probably the best advice on how to handle that. But there are all kinds of things that churches can do. I mean, first of all, sort of along the lines of what we've been talking about, pray. This is a big battle, and I think it's going to be tougher this time around than when we pushed for the prostitution laws we have now. Pray for those survivor leaders who are kind of at the forefront of this battle. They are incredibly strong and brave, but it takes a deeply personal toll to fight this because they've lived it. It's very personal, right? But their voices and their experiences need to be heard and respected by the ones who are making the decisions. That is just so important. Pray for us, for our allies and partners, as we try to push back against this narrative that prostitution is work and that trafficking and prostitution are very different things. Advocate. Write to your MP, to the Justice Minister, to the Prime Minister. Tell them you think our prostitution laws are a critical tool in fighting sexual exploitation and need to be not just upheld, but enforced. Because as I said, that's not happening evenly across the country. And they need to hear from us in significant numbers because the pro-sex lobby is well organized and well funded. And so we need to send a different message, at least as loudly and clearly. I should say that a lot of this conversation that's happening in Canada is happening everywhere. right? So this is not just a Canadian conversation. So this push to delink prostitution and human trafficking, to make this very clear delineation between the two, as though one has little or nothing to do with the other, is happening globally. And it's very troubling because it's dishonest, it's inaccurate, and completely ignores the realities of the commercial sex trade. But it's an idea that has a lot of traction. So, for example, at the UN level, there is a move or a push to kind of redefine all human trafficking as forced labor. So this would mean we would no longer talk about labor trafficking and sex trafficking, but all of it would be considered forced labor. So this, of course, comes from that narrative that says sex work is work, and it's only a problem if it's forced.
Okay.
Well, we don't believe that prostitution should be legitimized as a form of work. It's not work, it's exploitation. And we surely can and must do better as a society than to accept prostitution as a solution to female poverty or lack of livelihood. But these kinds of shifts in language and conversation are happening globally. They're certainly happening here. And so this is something that we and our allies are very, very concerned about. So we need to find a way to communicate back to our government that, you know what? No, this is not acceptable. This is not the way it is. I think, church communities can consider all kinds of things. They could raise awareness about human trafficking, organize an information night for your church community, bring someone in to come talk about it. Talk about it with your parents, with your young people. So everybody kind of understands what it looks like and how it works and what we can do. There are a lot of organizations doing very good work here in Canada and around the world. Find out who they are. Find out who in your community is working on these issues. Who are the frontline groups who are working with victims? How can you support them? One of the things I really like to highlight is something Defend Dignity, which is an organization we work very closely with, leads. And they put together what they call first response bags. So these are bags that are filled with basic items for women who are leaving exploitive situations. So they would put in a phone card, a Walmart card, personal hygiene items, pajamas, underwear, socks, and so on. They have a list on their website. These bags are provided to local police, to the victim services, who give them as gifts to victims of exploitation. So this is such a simple, tangible, and meaningful way for churches to both support victims of exploitation and to build relationships with their local police department. So churches who are interested in doing something like that can get in touch with Defend Dignity, and they'd be happy to help you get it started. So there are simple things like that mean so much and make such a difference. Like Defend Dignity can hardly keep up, right? Because the police use them and they keep saying, we'd love more. Because they put them to such good use and they are so appreciated by the girls.
And I imagine it's also a befriending tool, right? Even if they're not ready to leave yet. When I did that Faith Today story a few years ago, I spent the evening with a worker who was, a frontline worker going around in her car from young woman to young woman and offering just that kind of bag. And I could see how powerful it was. Like it was like, oh, someone is caring for me and giving me something nice. And it was quite touching. And you're right, simple, but really a reminder of dignity, I would imagine.
Yeah. And then we have examples in the Toronto area. There's a collective of churches who've come together to start a safe house, and they've consulted carefully with experts. They've got, they sort of took the time to develop the knowledge and build the expertise. And that's been really exciting to watch. So, you can kind of go, there's a full spectrum of things that can be done. Actually, Defend Dignity, again, they lead a workshop on a circle of response that sort of shows you that full spectrum of engagement and things that you can do.
Yeah. You mentioned survivor leaders, I think was the term you used. Tell me more about some of those people, because I'm guessing you're referring to women who have left or gotten out or escaped and now committed themselves to ending it. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. So a lot of them will start support organization. So they will, as I said, they will work with women who are currently being exploited. You know, like you said, building those relationships, that place of safety, helping them with needs, and helping them on their journey of exiting, hopefully. There are others who work specifically with women who are exiting, and a lot of them do advocacy. You know, they said, this matters enough that I am going to commit my time and my energy and my life to advocating for something better for women in Canada.
Yeah. I would imagine it would be profoundly frustrating for you, Julia, and your coworkers on this issue when you're battling that idea that sex work is not exploitative, you know, at its very heart. And I'm wondering, how do you respond to that? Like, what do you actually say in argument back to that idea?
Yeah, well, one of my friends, Trisha, once said that, you know, it's crazy that it's become sort of a feminist argument, right?
Yeah.
That this is empowering, that this is safe, you know. And her response, she said that once at one of our forums we held, like, true feminism was never about me. It was never about my personal choices, my personal autonomy. It was about the bettering of the condition of life, raising the level of life for all women.
Okay.
And so that's sort of how we look at this issue. So, you know, again, not all people in prostitution would meet the definition of trafficking. Some do say they're choosing it, that it's work, that they feel empowered, but they are part of a system and an industry. And that is exploitive and predatory. It is a system that is built on the subordination of women. It is not empowering. It is based on inequality, and I would argue a fundamental barrier to equality. It's a system that preys on vulnerabilities, and it's an affront to the dignity of every person. So if we use that sort of very wide lens on the issue, we would say that the exploitation of women and girls in the commercial, of anyone in the commercial sex industry, is a form of systemic violence, particularly against women and girls. And the attitudes and the beliefs about women that give permission to and perpetuate this exploitation and violence are a threat to the safety of all women and girls. So if we legitimize or reinforce the beliefs that women are sexual objects, that their bodies are commodities, if we allow them to be dehumanized in this little pocket over here, that thinking doesn't stay there. It ripples throughout the culture and affects the safety and equality of all women and girls. So I think that's the lens that we need to go through and say, what is this doing for the safety and equality of all of us, of all women? Do we need to ask the question, are all women and girls a little less safe in a world where we accept that these ones over here, it's okay for people to work their stuff out on them? Well, what does that do for the rest of us? So we need to be very concerned about these women and say, this is not okay. But we also need to understand that if as a society we say this is okay over here, it doesn't just stay there. It affects everybody.
Yeah,
So
that's a very compelling argument. I find it hard to believe someone could argue back effectively when you say things like that.
Yeah.
So you've been working clearly with a wide range of partners on this issue. I'm wondering if people have been surprised that to find, you know, an evangelical organization so deeply involved in this issue. I would think it would be a good discovery. What's that been like for you?
There's a lot of jokes about strange bedfellows.
Yeah. I was resisting using
Yeah. But it's, you know what, it's been incredibly rewarding. You know, we know that a lot of the organizations we work with and partner with, a lot of them are faith-based and would share all kinds of things in common with us. But we also are intentional about learning from and working from people who have different expertise, who may disagree with us profoundly on a whole bunch of things. But what we have in common is this desire to put an end to sexual exploitation. And so we come together around that purpose. we each speak our own language, but we argue fundamentally the same things. With this conference I mentioned that I was at a few weeks ago is like, it's an international gathering. I can't remember how many people from how many countries, but it's such an amazing spectrum because, there's women's organizations and feminists and academics and lawyers and people of all kinds of faiths and no faith. But everybody is there to learn from each other, to sort of keep up on top of the trends and the research and what are our best strategies and how can we message and what do we do and how do we fight this? Because it is a battle that is enormous, and we're pushing back against an industry that is very wealthy, very determined, and stands to lose a lot, right? It's a whole lot of money. So we have to come together. And it takes each of us kind of in our own corners doing what we do and also coming together. So that's been really rewarding. I think, particularly working with the survivor-led groups has been amazing. I have learned so much. And when I say that they've changed the way I look at these issues and the world and changed me, I don't think that's even an understatement. They are remarkable, their resilience and their strength. And it's really enriched my life in significant ways. I get to work with incredible people who are on the front lines, either supporting women directly or advocating for change. And I would say over the last number of years that we've been working on this issue, we've seen many church communities really sort of catch a vision for what the church can and should be doing to help. And that has been incredibly rewarding. There is a lot of passion out there to do something and to make a difference. But it's difficult, right? Like you said, you talked about the passage of PSEPA, and this was such a victory. It felt like it was a complete revolution in how this country deals, not just with the issue of prostitution, but with people who are prostituted.
And that's Bill C-36.
Yeah,
right?
It was like Canada finally said, you know what? Sexual exploitation is not acceptable and we're going to do something about it. So to have all of that feel very tenuous and at risk at this point is heartbreaking, and it's discouraging. We're facing an uphill battle, but we're not going to give up, and there are many of us who are committed to not giving up and to keeping at this. And so we need you to join us and to pray for us and with us and add your voices to this, because it really matters. It matters greatly, not just for those who are being exploited, but like I said, for all of us.
So a few years ago, we were asking people to write letters or contact their MP to say, we want this bill. And now we should do the same to say we need to keep this alive in Canada. Is that right?
Yeah. So we have, we'll get a sample letter up soon that will help people to sort of communicate that. Yes, we want this legislation upheld and we want it enforced consistently across the country. So when the legislation was passed, there was kind of a 5-year review built into it. We're about halfway through that period now. Let it stand, make sure it's being enforced evenly, let it stand. And then you can evaluate, where are we at? How did it work? How did this, where can we improve? But I think that would still be our argument. There will be room for improvement, but we need that approach that fundamentally says it's not acceptable to pay for sex.
Julia, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your hard work on this issue on behalf of us all, really. And people can then go to the EFC website in the next couple of weeks and find that letter and maybe some more guidance about what to do next.
Yeah. Yes.
Wonderful.
And our brief, I believe, is probably posted now, maybe, or will be posted today. Okay. Our submission to the Justice Committee. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. So please, thank you for joining us. Visit the efc.ca to find the brief that Julia mentioned, soon a sample letter, and other information on this issue and more. You can watch this webinar and others at the efc.ca/webinars. Thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.